Andy, can the agency with its current authority function? Does it have the power to create this new regulatory infrastructure on its own?
There's a lot that it can do and is doing on its own, and Peggy will, I'm sure, speak to a lot of that in just a little while. But there are many things it cannot do. It cannot change internally or by itself. It needs external support, and it's broad in its nature. Jim Greenwood is here from Bio, and Bio has put an enormous amount of effort and energy into looking systematically across a number of potential changes that Congress will need to make with regard to authorities and new opportunities for the agency. I think there needs to be a much broader collaboration with the private sector with regard to the kind of inputs that the agency needs for change. One of the things that I think is essential is that we create in the future, at the level of the agency, the commissioner, an external, if you will, board of directors that can act in that exact fashion. I had it when I was at the NCI. I had the National Cancer Advisory Board, Board of Scientific Advisors, Board of Scientific Counselors that enabled that input for the change process. That kind of thing doesn't exist very well at the agency.
You know, the agency also needs to be adequately funded. It's been chronically underfunded going back decades. And, you know, nobody likes regulators. I think that's part of the problem. But the reality is we want the FDA to do the best possible work. It needs to have adequate funding, and that's been a chronic problem. I wanted to comment on Don's point. Also, I agree with everything you said about these smaller and smaller populations, but there are some diseases like cardiovascular where we're going to be looking at large populations. We don't have to do these clinical trials in the most expensive and laborious fashion that we did in the past. We just finished enrolling a study in a new obesity drug, very important study. We started it in June, and we just enrolled close to our 10,000th patient. Unbelievable. But we made it simple and easier. We took a lot of the fluff out. You know, we've made the process of drug development more complex than it needs to be. And there are ways to do what people call large and simple trials, where at the end of the day, you just want to know, you know, are there more bodies standing with one therapy than another? And if you do that, and if you do it right, it doesn't have to be enormously expensive as it's been.
Yeah, so I agree approximately.
Yeah.
But you've got 10,000 patients. Think of high-risk relapse Wilms tumor. Less than 100 patients in the country per year. How are we going to develop drugs for them? And I'm a little bit worried, Steve, about the 10,000 patients, because that consumes a set, admittedly in an inexpensive way, it consumes a set of patients that might be better used, if I can use that term, to investigate other therapies. And I'm not sure about cardiology, but I know in cancer and in other diseases, the number of possible therapies are growing like crazy. So there's false positives, there's false negatives, and we completely ignore false neutrals, the things that we don't investigate. And it's a major issue.
I'd have a question for Joe.
Well, I was going to just go ahead.
And we're talking about trial designs, but what about post-market and a phase 4 trial? And from the industry's point of view, are we ready for a serious commitment to post-market surveillance, utilizing the amazing progress in information technologies of American Express can monitor my credit card and separate signal from noise? Can we get to a point in collaboration with the sponsors that we can do a much better job of phase 4 so we reduce this dependence on phase 3?
Well, the answer is absolutely yes. And in fact, I want to just go back to one point. I'm an engineer, and at Massimo, we have a saying that in God we trust. For everything else, we need data. So it's not like we're saying we don't want to test things, we don't want to have comparative effectiveness or things like that. But as you mentioned, when you have these orphan diseases, or in our case, where you have medical devices that don't have a $1 billion or $10 billion market, they have a small market potential, and if you put this 10,000 patient criteria as a randomized control trial to prove everything before the FDA will clear it, some innovations will never get to market. And by the way, if you tried to do that with angioplasty 30, 40 years ago when it came out, it wasn't as good as bypass.
Well, it still isn't.
Well, it isn't, but you know what? It served the purpose until you got your bypass, and now you have these drug-eluting stents that are as good as bypass. So it evolves. You know, technology, medical device side is not like a drug where it's a
The
formula,
bypass got better
it's
too,
set,
but-
and that's it for 20 years. They evolve.
Yeah.
And you've got to have an FDA that understands that. It doesn't put the same criteria for everything, if it's an orphan disease, medical device, or a drug.
Any
So I-
questions out there? While Don talks.
I just want to say, I'm not saying that the FDA insists on 10,000 patient studies. They understand these issues. And for example, Gleevec has like 11 indications, and some of them are 10 patients were accrued. So, but it's done informally, and it should be done in some sort of formal fashion, is what I'm saying.
I agree with you.
Question?
This is Marcus Roberts again from Xerox. It has been said that the FDA is very conservative and risk averse because you can get pulled in front of Congress if people die because you approved the drug. You will not get dragged in front of Congress if people die because you rejected the drug. Is there something that could be changed around that? Either one of those two.
You know, I just don't buy that at all. You know, again,
That's
this
because you haven't been in front of
this
those
is,
hearings.
listen, I've been in front of Congress, you know, with you, in fact, you may remember, and let me just say that, you know, having high standards for approval of drugs is not the wrong thing. What I think you will find amongst the regulators is they understand that when you have a drug for a life-threatening condition where there really isn't much else, they're quite able to lower the bar, but then to require sufficient studies in phase 4. In cancer, Don, they've done it over and over again. They've looked at progression-free survival, and they've said, this is enough to approve the drug, but you got to do the real survival trial after approval. That's good policy. But, you know, if you take a drug like Vioxx, it was approved, wasn't any better pain reliever than any other drugs. It was supposed to be safer. And so, you know, we've made some big mistakes in society on drug approvals that the society has paid for. And the FDA has to keep those standards rigorous.
But I think he has a point. Look, when the whistleblower letters came out, late 2008, and I remember as President Obama was coming in, he got the letter too. From a device side, the FDA changed. The FDA, everyone got afraid of approving something that later, and leadership was afraid of telling people below, approve it, because they could be hauled in. So I think, you know what could really help? I think if the president went and held a town hall meeting at the FDA and said, there's a balance between innovation and making sure Americans don't get hurt. And you know what? But I've got your back, because that balance has to be met. And I've got your back, go take some risk, get things approved, and we improve the people, I think we'd go a long ways.
So, Joe, there is a balance now. It's not clear it's the right balance, that there is a balance. And we may not get hauled, they may not get hauled in front of Congress, but they will eventually get hauled in front of God or their maker or, you know, their conscience.
But I have to jump in here because, first of all, if you look at the culture, as I did, at the people at FDA and compared it to the culture I lived in at MD Anderson when I was in academia and when I was at NIH, they're exactly the same people. They want to do great and good things for people. They want to approve that drug that's going to cure cancer, if you will. But they live in a system, and they live in a culture, and they live in an environment. And in spite of what Steve is saying, there was not one hearing that I ever got called before to congratulate the FDA for having done something positive. That's the reality. And if to think it doesn't
like marriage.
influence us is just... Now, the issue is, what we haven't done as a culture is to address the question, what is the cost to society for not approving something or making it available to patients earlier in the process when it could have saved a lot of lives. What is that risk-benefit balance? And we have not had a really intelligent conversation about that. And the FDA needs that kind of broader ecosystem conversation, whether it's in Congress or in forums like this, as to what is our level of tolerance and what will we support that agency for doing. Steve's raised the point in cancer. Well, the cancer advocacy group, the AIDS advocacy group, they forced those changes. And they brought in accelerated approval and faster track. Those were 15 years ago and 10 years ago. They should now be more the standard and the norm rather than for exceptional or unusual cases, because we've matured. We have new ways of gathering data. We have ways of understanding mechanism of action before we ever even use a drug in human patients, like a P0 trial. Those things need to be more broadly and widely utilized.
But go ahead, Steve.
I was going to say, how do we know that it's going to save lives if we haven't adequately tested it? The problem is you're making the assumption that every innovation is better than what we already have. And the only way we know whether it's better is if we adequately test it. If we do it on faith, we're going to take people that might have a reasonable response to an existing therapy, and we're going to put them on a therapy
I didn't
that's
say we
inferior.
weren't going to test it. I
Why do you
said we're
assume-
not going to test it the way we're doing it now,
Well,
Why do you
which is what
assume we're
Joe
not gonna
said.
test it?
Because in Europe, with medical devices, they don't test them at all.
That's not true. The companies test products. It's just sending your test reports to a body to say, is it good enough? Is the difference between Europe and
That's
US.
like having the fox
Well,
or the chicken
in
coop.
Europe,
That's
don't
not
we?
true. We have a
Doesn't
reputation
your
to
doesn't reimbursement drive a lot of that testing in Europe?
Pardon
Joe,
me?
doesn't reimbursement drive a lot of that testing in Europe?
No, not to my knowledge. No, I think, look, under a CE marking system, there's certifications that you have to have certain procedures for design, production, testing. And if you meet
Randomization
those-
is not one of them.
Pardon me?
Randomization
That's
is
right.
not one of them.
Well, that's not true, actually. You're talking about a randomized control trial, but if you're making a product, there's a way to test it compared to a previous generation to see, is it better or worse? Not is it going to have an impact on the patient's efficacy, but you can see if the product is better than the predecessor you made. See, and I believe in randomized control trials. I think they're wonderful.
The proof of the
but not
pudding is in
every
the
product
eating,
can
and the
afford
eating
it.
is actually in the human.
Pardon me?
The proof of the pudding is in the eating. And in this case, the eating is how does it work in the human? And it's difficult to say. They're not doing randomized clinical trials. They may be doing randomization in the lab.
Well,
or
for
something.
certain products
Okay,
they do.
well,
I'm not here to defend Europe. All I'm trying to say is that the safety and risks in Europe are not any higher than it is in the US.
I have
the
to-
data is not there.
I have to jump in here for a second and say that, let me give you a great example. There are defibrillator leads that the companies tested, and they said, this is a superior defibrillator lead. It performs much better in the laboratory than what we have. And they got a 510K, and they marketed it. And a lot of people died because those leads failed in human beings. When the defibrillator went off, the defibrillator didn't work, and the patient died. So don't tell me
but that was
that
post-market surveillance.
I'm not sure we answered the question.
No, but we are out of time.
Don't tell me that you can figure out everything a device is going to do in a human being in a laboratory.
Well, then
Now, this is, we have to wrap up now, but this is perfect. Now, we all know what it's like to be Peggy Hamburg. And she's going to be out here in a minute, and I thank all of you for what I thought was a really thoughtful and
As you wanted, a
crash
controversial panel.
crash course in regulatory science for everyone here. Thanks so much, guys.